good afternoon, everybody. It's a real pleasure to welcome you in the last Hot Off the Press event of this year of a research platform, the Challenges of Urban Futures. We have the pleasure of having with us Elisabetta Mocca, and we will be discussing her book, Cities in Search of Freedom, European Municipalities Against the Leviathan. And you can guess who the Leviathan is. Anyway. I will shortly present the participants, the main participants. So the author, Elisabetta Mocca, and Justus Uitermark and Jaime Palomera, who will be act as discussants. And then the floor will be theirs for half an hour presentation and 10 minutes comments, and then finally we can open up the discussion with every participant if you have questions or comments. Elisabetta, it's a pleasure to have you here. Elisabetta graduated in Italy quite some time ago. In the meantime, she took her PhD in London, and then she spent more than 10 years in the UK, in London, at Westminster University, and then in Edinburgh, before joining the department in Vienna for a postdoc university assistant position, and where she is now also still Marie Jahoder Fellow. But in the meantime, she moved also to Salamanca in Spain as a USAL for Excellence Fellowship holder, which is something like the Marie Curie Fellowship, which allows mobility of excellent scholars around Europe. So where she will be for a few years, I guess. I think it's 2 years or more.
Yeah, 2.5 years.
Okay, good, perfect. She has been publishing quite a lot. She has a background in political studies, and actually she has been publishing a lot on urban-related issues with major journals like Antipode and others. And actually, her interests are quite intersectional. So it's not just cities, but it's cities in relation to the state, cities in relation to the environment. She was working a lot also on post-growth development, social policies related to cities, etc. So we will hear today her last book presentation, and the book was published just a few months ago with Bristol University Press. And actually, this book fits very well also our research interest in the platform, because we have today as discussants Justus Uitermark and Jaime Palomera. Justus is from the University of Amsterdam, and Jaime is in Barcelona from La Hydra. And altogether, we have a project on municipalism. So it's, I think, the perfect fitting to discuss this book. Justus is a professor of urban geography at the University of Amsterdam, where he's also the director of the Amsterdam Institute for Social Science Research. We've been knowing each other for quite some time, and it's a pleasure to have you here. Thanks a lot. Justus is working on many urban-related issues, in particular with social movements and the city, upon which he published a lot of contributions, but also now increasingly on computational science-related issues. So there will be next year, hopefully, a discussion of his latest book about Instagram and the city. I don't know the exact title, but it's still forthcoming. So you will eventually tell us something more later on. And Jaime Palomera is a PhD in social anthropology at the University of Barcelona, but he has also a master at Goldsmiths College in London. And he has been a visiting scholar at the Graduate Center at CUNY in New York. So I didn't know that. So he has quite a peculiar profile, because he has a strong academic record, but at the same time, he has let's say, like Justus and others, participate in an emancipatory epistemology reflection, so to say, and also as an activist in Barcelona, where he produces research, but it's also politically driven and committed to kick off process of urban change, which is quite a relevant issue for us nowadays. And okay, I'll stop here. I will leave the room to Elisabetta and presentation. So thanks a lot for being with us, both Elisabetta, Justus, and Jaime. And the floor is yours. Half an hour, more or less, 40 minutes presentation, and then we open the floor for the discussion.
I will try to keep it as short as I can. Of course, it's not that easy to summarize a book, but I will try to do my best. So my presentation is kind of divided according to the different chapters, but I will explain you why I included these chapters in my book. So I will start explaining what the rationale of the book is, so why I decided to write a book about cities and their attempt to get more and more freedom. I will briefly go through the analytical approach that I use, and especially focusing on the main concepts or pair of concepts that I use in the book. And then I will reflect on the main features of the book, which characterize the different chapters. So which are the historical perspective that I use, a multidimensional geographical focus, a behavioral angle on cities, endeavor to increase their freedom, and an ideological viewpoint. So I see these efforts as ideologically driven, and the way I adopt in a plural approach. So I will explain what and which actors in cities I took into account. And of course, as usual, I will spend a few words to conclude the presentation. So let's start with the rationale underpinning the book. As you all know, because you already work on cities, you know that in the last 30 years or so, cities gain a greater influence. And I use the word influence because I don't want to exaggerate with the word autonomy, although I use it quite frequently in the book. But the way I understand autonomy is not a very legal concept. Is very much about the idea of cities increase their soft power. So the way they improve their agency in national and international political affairs by participating in multiple networks with other peers, in the way they acquire a proactive role in policy making. So cities are not anymore just the policy takers, so passive agent receiving from the states policies and law, but they're participating in an active way in this process. And the way cities acquired a standing, an important standing in current international debates. So often we see how mayors or local policymakers participate in discussion on themes like the environment, social policies, economy, and the like. So the purpose of the book is to provide a reflection of previous empirical research on cities that I've been working on since my PhD. So I've been working on cities and different issues revolving around the urban dimension for a few years now. And I had as a main aim the willingness to elaborate an evidence-based middle range of theory of cities autonomy. Of course, here I don't want to boast much in my book as an attempt to elaborate a theory, but a more modest aim is there to see. And as you might have understood in this few minutes I've been talking, the main object of the study, of my study, are cities. And in the introduction, I explain what kind of cities I focused on in the book. So first of all, European cities. I decided to restrict my my focus on this type of cities for different reasons. Very briefly, because European cities have a long-standing history of cooperation. So we can go back to the Hanseatic League, so to the Middle Ages. But more recently, the first attempt to create a network, a cooperative network, go back to the beginning of the last century. So there is quite a story out there. Then I decided to focus mainly on first and second tier cities, so basically capital cities as well as the second cities, so economic and political hubs. I dropped few references throughout the book about the smaller cities because, of course, I didn't want to cast aside them because even in the news, we hear about how many small cities can provide a contribution, okay, or they can get away from the grip of the state. But of course, as you can imagine, the larger cities, the greater is the influence. And finally, the category of cities I wanted to write about were non-compliant municipalities. Here the reference is to Alve's work on the rebel cities, but I didn't use the word rebel because it was too strong, and also because it requires a more careful description of what municipal rebellion is. But not compliant, it means that these cities try to break the link with the state. And of course, here we can discuss a lot about how you can define a city as non-compliant, also because this ability to break away from the state very much depends also on the political leaning of a city. It depends on what kind of city government is in place. So if there is a discrepancy with the central government or whether there is an agreement. But in principle, in my the attempt that I wanted to pursue was to include this kind of cities. So moving on to the analytical approach, the way I understood cities was to refer to them as socio-political agents. I didn't want to see cities as sites, so as simple places where something happening there. I conceptualize cities as active agents. Of course, it is difficult to see cities as one unique agent because, of course, as we all know, in cities there are manifold agents. And of course, in the book, I took it into account. So some chapters are more devoted to explain how municipal policymakers act in order to expand cities' influence. And on the other hand, some chapters are also devoted to discuss how civil society is engaged in broadening urban influence and the urban power. So what you can see is that I omitted economic agents because it's completely different ideas in there, and there would be another story. So I wanted to keep the focus on politics in there. And indeed, I wanted to do so because I conceptualize urban politics as properly political, so not just an emanation of state policy, politics, or a reaction to state policy, but as an independent field in political sociology and political science. And in particular, in the book, I wanted to delve deeper in the impact on state-local relations. So urban politics is understood relationally. So the way cities react to state actions and try to intervene in state and international politics. So although I focus on urban politics as a self-standing field, I do conceptualize it not as a black box, but as I said, relationally. So the way urban politics is produced by urban agents and the way they react to upper level events. So by looking at the city-state relation, I focus more neatly on two realms of freedom: the international arena and the urban space. Some chapters focus on the way cities behave at the international level by putting in place paradiplomatic behaviors, by threading cooperation, linkages with other cities, and entering into conflict with states and sometimes with the European Union as well. At the same time, another realm of freedom is the urban space. because as I will explain later on in this presentation, it is where cities, where urban actors can innovate, can experiment, can elaborate new solutions to urgent problems, social problems, economic problems, and environmental problems. As you can see here, the state, the national level, is not part of these realms of freedom, because for cities, the state, I don't want to use the term enemy, but it's the Leviathan at the end of the day. So it means that the state can constrict cities' freedom of movement. So in that sense, the city cannot acquire greater influence at the national level. Over the book, I analyzed these aspects by adopting an historical perspective. So I tried, which was a kind of a difficult task, and of course there are manifold books that aptly explain how municipal autonomy evolved over time. But I wanted to include this chapter because I think that by looking back, we can better understand the present, and of course we can have some ideas about how the future of municipal autonomy will be. It was also important to cast an historical outlook on municipal autonomy because it shows how the story of cities is actually dotted by periods of prosperity and periods where cities were not that important. Secondly, I adopted a geographical focus, in particular looking at the interplay between the local and the global. And there is a specific chapter analyzing how cities retain their specificity besides the fact that we are living in global times. Another chapter is more focused on this behavior angle. So I wanted to explain how cities' international attitudes is part and parcel of specific political attitudes and cultural attitudes that cities adopt. Also, there is a chapter more, let's say, more ideological. I wanted to show how cities' endeavors to become more and more autonomous are not just practical. Of course, the cities do stuff in order to become more and more autonomous, but these efforts are based on specific political and cultural values, which I dared to name as ideology. And finally, I adopted a plural approach, as I explained a few minutes ago. I wanted to acknowledge the fact that not just municipal governments, so not just the political elite, but also urban residents contribute to enhance and strengthen cities' efforts to become freer. So let's start with the historical perspective. Of course, here I briefly summarize the main points of the chapter because I don't want to explain how since the very beginning of the story of cities, they evolved and they acquired more or less autonomy. And also because it was kind of a peculiar exercise to analyze the evolution of municipal autonomy, in as much as there were two main problems. First, defining from an historical perspective what a city is. It seems like a trivial task, but actually is not, because in prehistorical time or in the Middle Age, the idea of a city was very much different from the one we have now. So a little bit of approximation was in need in order to write such chapter. And secondly, also the definition of municipal autonomies proved to be challenging because autonomy, as we all know, is a legal concept and laws varied tremendously over the century. So I understood the concept of autonomy as a sort of self-determination. So not as much as a legal concept, but more as a political one. So the capacity of cities to administer themselves and the way they were able to obtain autonomy, to obtain powers and competencies from upper levels of authorities. And in order to write this chapter, I adopted an evolutionary approach, which is very much akin to historical institutionalism. It's called evolutionary institutionalism. And it was really helpful to show the ebbs and flows of municipal autonomy. So the way cities acquired and lose strength over the century is really interesting. And it shows how it is a sort of zero-sum game with the state. So the more the states acquire powers and strength, the more cities lose it. And another element that was really important to understand the evolution of municipal autonomy was the fact that this was the byproduct of the local elite negotiation capacity. So, of course, we cannot use the term policymakers for medieval authorities, but these local political elites were able to negotiate with upper level of authorities their political capacity, their administrative capacities as well. And so the ability of these elites to acquire autonomy was a power game indeed. And when local elites were weak, of course, the cities were not able to take an important standing. But it was municipal autonomy did not depend only on this power game. Also important ideas and the way they changed over time influenced the wideness of cities' autonomy. For instance, where there were ideas like promoted by the Cluniac movement in the Middle Age or municipal socialism later on in the 20th century, cities acquired a new standing, a new position in the political game. So this mix between the economic power, the economic influence, the political importance of cities, and also values and ideas shaped the strength of cities. Then, abandoning the historical chapter, I then move on to a geographical scope, on to understanding why cities retained their political autonomy. And in particular, in this chapter, I try to understand the local global tensions, because of course, when you talk about cities' freedom, you cannot but think about globalization. So there is a stream of research saying that basically cities are disappearing, they are losing the power, the characteristics, because there is a homogenizing force which is making cities more and more alike. So what's the point of writing about cities if all the cities are becoming equals? Well, actually, I don't really think that cities are becoming equal and that urban identity is flattening. It is indeed true that we can see similar characteristics in many cities. So we see the same physical places. We can see Starbucks, McDonald's, or the same construction techniques repeated, I don't know, in Italy, in Austria, rather than in the US or wherever. But I do not believe the thesis of the disappearing of the local. So what I wanted to do in the book, and in particular in one of the chapters, was to sidestep the idea of globalization and global world city theories, not because I reject them completely, but I think that they're missing some important dynamics in place in cities. So the fact that while some characteristics are withering away, others are resisting these homogenizing forces. And cities are actually reactive agents to globalization. So they are shaping their identity. And the way they do that is to focus on the internal dynamics. Cities can also be sites of innovation, they are sites of experimentation. So the way globalization impacts on cities may be different from one city to another. And also, cities are reacting to globalization by deepening the intercity connections. So this may sound as a paradox, but actually cities are harnessing globalization in order to become more and more, I don't want to say independent, but more autonomous. And they are undertaking what is called the scale jumping. So they skip the state, the national level, and try to create a connection, urban connection with peers scattered in Europe, but also in the world, in order to tackle very place-specific problems. And in this way, I understand local autonomy as the reflection of local identity and culture, and as the outcome of cities' identity making process, whereby not only local policymakers, but also civil society at urban level try to elaborate a distinctiveness, a distinctive identity of cities. And also from a cultural perspective, the way cities react to globalization is by boosting the place attachment and the sense of belonging. So living in New York or living in Vienna is not the same thing. So the experience of citizens will be completely different, maybe not complete. Some aspects will repeat themselves, but the other will be very place specific. Then in another chapter, I wanted to deepen the fact that cities harness globalization in order to deepen their connections with other cities. And I was really interested in, for a while, I published a few articles on paradiplomacy, or in particular municipal diplomacy, because I think that this is an interesting political and cultural phenomenon that it is often overlooked by political science. And actually, it is really meaningful, and it tells us something about the moment, the world we are living in. And as I will conclude the talk, basically, paradiplomacy is a sort of a symbol of a postmodern world. And an aspect that makes paradiplomacy really interesting is the fact that cities mimic the state. So, of course, in a different way, because the state has specific legal and political characteristics. So the state is sovereign. The state has specific powers, in particular, can force other subjects to undertake a specific behavior. And through diplomacy, states can avoid conflict, hopefully. Of course, cities cannot emulate these kind of characteristics because they are not sovereign entity. They do not have such strong powers, and they cannot stop other entities to enter into war. But they are characterized by functional equivalence. So through paradiplomacy, they show self-determination, they show soft power, especially political influence, and they can engage in latent contention behavior. So of course we are not talking about entering to war with the state or with other cities, but there might be conflicts, and often these conflicts are with the central state. And city diplomacy is also an outcome of the increasing opportunities that a city can harness. First of all, EU opportunity structures. So basically the EU fostered cities, an increased cities autonomy, in as much as there were EU funds dedicated to cities, also legislation at the EU level incorporated cities. in order to consider how urban problems were really salient and had to be tackled at the urban level. At the national level, in many European countries, there were also decentralization reforms that allowed cities to get more and more power. So there was this trickle down of legal competencies towards cities. But the fact that cities could acquire greater ability to increase their autonomy, it was not just a passive process, but cities became active seekers of more freedom. So they wanted to negotiate with the EU as well as with the central states more and more room for maneuver. So it is like a two-way process where cities obtain as well as ask for greater freedom. Another important aspect of paradiplomacy is that it can be seen as a means of recognition. So basically, cities can be seen as credible negotiators and committed entities. More and more we hear about, and we read also in newspapers about cities taking a stand on specific matters. For instance, a few months ago, cities around Europe organized sit-ins and in order to increase awareness about the war in Ukraine. The same goes for environmental issues. So city diplomacy, it is a way for cities to become more and more influenced. From a territorial perspective, also paradiplomacy can be seen as an instrument to undertake a process of delinking and relinking. So basically, by engaging at the international level, cities are trying to shy away from the state, but at the same time, they create new territorial linkages, new territorial bound with other cities. So it is this multiple dimensional and territorial process then paradiplomacy allows. And for a more conflictual perspective, paradiplomacy is an instance of the central local conflict because it shows how we are living the Westphalian kind of state, where the central state is the main protagonist of politics, and we are going towards a more postmodern type of state where other agents than the state are engaged in political affairs. And after talking about cities' attitudes and cities' activities, I want to dig deeper on the main ideas behind paradiplomacy. Of course, paradiplomacy is very practical. Cities organize meetings, cities discuss main issue, they get together in order to solve a specific problem. But why they do that? What is the rationale for them for engaging in such activities? And in order to explain this from a more, let's say, metaphysical level, more ideological level, I conceptualized the idea of European municipalism, which I think that well explain or helps explain why cities engaged at multiple levels. So they're very proactive in this way. And of course, we can see that European municipalism is at the same time a praxis and an ideology. It is a practice because, as I said, the cities do engage in activity, in practical activities. But the rationale underpinning this action, this willingness to act, is substantiated by ideas, by visions, and by values. And we can call these ideas, visions, and values as an ideology. Of course, European municipalism cannot be labeled as a grand ideology like socialism, but it is what Frieden would define as a thing-centered ideology. So basically, a thing-centered ideology is a corpus of ideas, is a vision. It includes a vision of the future and how the system should work. But of course, it doesn't cover all the aspects of society, politics, and economy. So European municipalism as a thing-centered ideology has a set of core concepts. So, which is really the core of the whole idea, is the municipal self-government. As I already said, cities want to become more and more autonomous. So increase their capacity to act, increase their powers, their policy-making competencies. Another core concept is mutuality universalism. I mentioned many times the fact that cities get together, they create linkages beyond national borders, and they have this, let's say, this vocation to unite. Cities are scattered in many states and discuss very urban specific problems. Looking at within Europe, they also have non-state-centric view of the European projects. So the idea of the Europes of the cities is up there, is for there something to cling on. These are the main concepts. But of course, European municipalism deals with other type of concepts which Frieden defines as coterminal concepts, meaning that European municipalism does talk about the relation between state and market, but there is really difficult to define a specific position, in as much as municipalism is not, let's say, is not politically inclined towards the left of the right. So we cannot see whether we cannot position European municipalism on a specific political camp. Of course, there are different variations. So let's say European Social Democrats would be keener on to have slightly more state and less market. But of course, here the variations are huge. The same goes for another dichotomous couple, which is participation and elite. So in principle, European municipalism predicates the need to increase participation, meaning the participation of less privileged cities in different get-together, more participation for citizens. But actually, the way this is materialized is very much different, and it is not impossible to find the element of elitism in European municipalism, also because in many cases, let's say, more powerful and wealthier cities are also those that tend to be part of a greater number of networks. And finally, other themes, other ideas that are part and parcel of European municipalism are innovation, inclusiveness, and sustainability. If you ever bumped into the different documents or the websites that are produced by European city networks, you will realize that how these words are crucial in the documents, in the activities they are engaged. But actually, they are quite fuzzy concepts. So it is not that easy to understand how municipalism, or rather European cities, materialize these kinds of ideas. But anyway, besides criticizing whether European municipalism is effective or not, what is really important to understand that it is an ideological base on which cities are trying to build a different type of European project where non-state actors are incorporated in the decision-making process. And on the other hand, European municipalism is a way for cities to emancipate from the state, because the state is not in the picture. It is a way for them to create a space, a niche of autonomy. And now I've been talking too much about the political elite. So from now, the debate and book in itself is very much focused on the political elite. Because even when talking about the European municipalism and ideology, I had in mind local policymakers, so local councillors, local officials engaged in paradiplomatic activities. But that is half of the story. So city autonomy is not just the byproduct of local elite, local political elite activities. Also, urban residents contribute to make cities more autonomous, or actually freer from the grip of the state. And I think that it was in order for me to include at least one chapter dedicated to how civil society contributes to substantiate these emancipatory efforts that cities undertake. And actually, I think that if we look at this side of the story, we better understand how cities are important political actors. And for this, I focused on the internal dynamics of cities. And in this way, I conceptualize them as eminent political entities. And by political, cities as political entity, I discussed the way politics entails conflict and deliberation. So we can understand at the same time cities as places where contention, where conflict is present. We can see, I don't know, protests and movements taking the streets and protests against the upper level decision, or even local level decision, when there is this conflict between urban residents and the local policy making elites, which is not an infrequent occurrence in cities. At the same time, cities are also sites of deliberations. So where actually residents, and sometimes with the cooperation of local political elites, try to pursue a different kind of politics. And cities are also political because, as we know, they allowed for the creation of webs of human relations. So there is the possibility to create links with similar people. So we go back to Weber and the initial urban sociology. So there's no reason for me to linger on this aspect. And cities, for these reasons, are plural spaces. And in this space, these characteristics allows for citizens, or actually for urban residents, to thrive and join in different networks. And here I use the term civitas activa. And I base this term on Hannah Arendt ideas of vita activa, so how people can actually participate in politics. I deliberately decided not to use the term active citizenship, which may resound the idea of civitas activa, because I think that this is a term that has been overused in social sciences, and because there is the problem of the term citizenship. And this is really important, especially in big cities, where actually people that participate in the political life might not be citizens of that state. So I think that the idea of civitas better render the plurality of the people, and how cities are characterized by clusters of diverse people, but all working towards similar aims. And so they cluster around a plethora of issues. And as I said, the Civita Activa may be either engaged in challenging authority or proposing new solutions. And the Civita Activa is is an instance of micropolitics of resistance and change. As you may probably know, there is a lot of writings in urban politics about movements and big actions put in place by important movements. But I think that urban politics is also characterized by smaller action of people engaged at the local level in order to obtain some change, either in the way politics work or in the way the urban lifestyle is featured. So I focus on, and I was more interested on these small political acts, which are political nonetheless, because they're trying to create a change. So I will conclude here with final words, which basically summarize my final chapters. And again, I resorted to the term post-modernity, because I think that we better understand the role of cities if we put them in a context which is characterized by disaggregation and fragmentation, whereby, as I said before, the state is not the main protagonist, is not anymore the main protagonist of international affairs, or is not the only Leviathan imposing itself on the lower level actors. But rather, there are different words that better describe the actual world system we're living in, like a heterarchy or polyarchy. So there is this idea of multiplicity, of pluralism, different scales, different levels, different actors engaged in this political game. And this is precisely this context of differentiation, disaggregation, disassembling, as we might want to call it, that allowed cities to thrive. And I conclude in a book by looking at the possible future. And of course, it's really difficult to read how cities will be and how they will act in the future. But I think that if we base our guess on the last big events, the critical juncture that characterized the last few years, we can see that cities might continue to get a greater role in social, cultural, and political affairs. If we look at how Europe enlarged on the East, so we saw that not only states were part of a new democratizing process in Eastern European countries, but also cities were really important in diffusing a democratic ideas, a democratic system. There is a flurry writing about how Eastern European cities became really protagonists in many networks, creating new cooperative linkages with Western European cities. At the same time, another critical juncture was the 2008 crisis, a period when many protests broke out in streets and where cities were actually theaters of new urban experiments to try to tackle the aftermath, the economic and social aftermath of the crisis. Brexit was also a critical juncture that showed how the perception of the European Union was really different from one place to another. And there were even attempts, like the most famous one being London, showing how London wanted to become independent. Of course, it didn't happen, but it was a very provocative idea. And finally, the COVID pandemic also showed how cities were really important for cities. Cities were really important for people. I think that my time is up because I heard a background noise, right?
Yeah, well, I think we are coming to an end of the presentation.
Yeah. So I stop here, and I think that I can stop sharing my screen.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks really a lot for this thought-provoking presentation and the very rich content of the book. I would immediately pass the floor to Justus first and to Jaime afterwards for their comments, and then you can react to their discussion issues. Justus, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Elisabetta, for writing a most stimulating book. So I very much appreciated how conceptually rigorous the book is. You're exceedingly careful in defining your concept. So let me just give one example. You have a discussion on paradiplomacy, and you're very careful to define the key terms that make up this concept, including influence, self-determination, and latent contention. Now, for people who are here, they can't see the entire discussion, but you really go deep into political philosophy in the precise meaning of these concepts. And I think all in all, that provides us with a very worthwhile contribution. Another thing that I really appreciated in the book is the type of literature it draws upon and that it situates itself in. To simplify, I think it's a very European book. So all the classics of urban studies are there, but you give it a very European twist. And you also draw upon literatures that I didn't know before to enrich this debate on cities as actors. So I very much appreciate the book. I think it's also going to be very helpful for our project. And now let me move to some questions or comments. And I guess the major question I asked to myself is whether I'm as optimistic as you are. So in your presentation, ultimately, you say that cities are increasingly gaining freedom to act, that the city actor is emerging, that it's taking on agency. And so this is a very appealing notion, right? So the city is emerging as this democratic agent. And I'm not sure if I'm as optimistic. And so then, of course, I had to ask myself, so why would I be more pessimistic? And I think it obviously relates to my local context. So I'm thinking, does this apply to Amsterdam? And your story does apply to Amsterdam in many ways. So Amsterdam also identifies as a rebel city. It identifies as a municipalist city. It is participating in all these international networks. So it's emerging as a political actor. However, has it also become a city that has more freedom? Is it a more democratic city? And here I have major hesitations. So to give one example, if I look at the domain of housing, for instance, then in the past, Amsterdam, although it served as an appendix of the national state, it nevertheless was a very important arena for democratic politics around housing. And the alderman of housing in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, was a celebrity in the Netherlands at large. He became widely known for the difference he makes in the housing market, socializing many housing units, democratizing decision making. And now today, I myself don't even know many of the aldermen, and this is because they're so horribly inconsequential. So the reason for this, I believe, is first of all, that cities are still very much encapsulated in the framework of the national state. But more importantly, and this is where I'm very curious to hear your thoughts, the scope of urban democracy is very much limited by the market. And so for you, the Levitian is the state, the central state. But if local governments really want to have decision-making powers, if they really want to gain more freedom, then they also need to have authority. They need to have the capacity to steer development within their jurisdiction. And I think in this respect, probably their influence actually decreased fairly substantially. So let me give one example that I think illustrates this tension. So it has to do with the housing of undocumented immigrants. So Amsterdam identifies as a rebel city. It has explicitly defied the central government. It said, we will shelter, not house, shelter undocumented immigrants. The minister protested. He said, like, no, we have to discourage undocumented immigration. So we must make sure that we don't accommodate these people. Well, the municipal government was defiant. It set up shelters. It provided people with a bed. So in that sense, it was a rebel city. However, when we look at the housing of regularized immigrants, so people who actually got a permit and who can now stay in the Netherlands, Amsterdam actually is the least successful city. So it fails to accommodate these regularized immigrants. So why is this? It's not because the city doesn't want to do it. It's simply because it doesn't have control over the housing stock in the way that it once did. So this drastically curtails its possibilities. And so I wonder, in your presentation, you were very explicit about this, whether it's possible to say that economic agency is a completely different story. So I think if you want to tell a story about political agency, then economic agency would be an important component of that. And to also give this a more theoretical twist, I fully agree with you that cities have become more salient as political actors. So they act in the realm of the European Union. They also profile themselves as agents in the international marketplace. So you might say, in this sense, that they acquired more agency, that they are more actors than they were before. So I fully agree with this. But is this really because they liberated themselves from central states? Or is it part of a more general process of political economic restructuring? So you quote Neil Brenner in your book and saying that he writes about the reconfiguration of global social space, which in a way is true, but he's also especially describing the growing salience of the global level, as well as the growing salience of the local level in terms of the capitalist restructuring of space. And so this matters because if the growing salience of the local is an outcome of these capitalist processes of restructuring, then it would be somewhat too optimistic to say that they're liberating themselves from the Levitian and acquiring greater agency. So let me put this maybe in a different way. So I think everything you write and say is completely correct, and I agree with it. But I do think that I would phrase it slightly differently. So you say, you write in terms of, you conceptualize this in terms of an ebb and flow, like cities become more or less agentic. And I think that at least when I look at the example of Amsterdam that I know best, but possibly others, I think maybe we should more think in terms of qualitatively changing configuration. So it's not that first they were encased in this framework and now that they're liberated. It's also not the case that first that they were liberated and they were very powerful and now not anymore because they have to operate in an international marketplace, but rather there's changing interdependence. Like they become more dependent on the market, they become more dependent on the European Union, they become less dependent on the nation state. And this then provides certain opportunities, but it also presents cities with certain constraints. So that's a less optimistic reading, but it's not an entirely pessimistic reading either. So those were sort of my major considerations. Then I have a couple of questions. You may want to answer them now, or you may want to reflect on them. And I was just curious about some things, like most trivially, why wouldn't you consider municipalism as a left-wing ideology? Because at least as far as I can see, municipalism is explicitly trying to push back against the market as well as overbearing states with the idea of promoting democracy and ultimately equality, which I would associate with the left. But I'm curious why you wouldn't do that. And then another thing I was very curious about, there's a very intriguing passage in your book. So I'll read a part of it. So you're saying it's a very explicitly theoretical book, and that's something to really appreciate. It's exceedingly careful. But you're saying the theoretical scaffolding does rest on empirical foundations. Indeed, you have extensive experience in applied urban research, and that informed the book. And so I was very curious because I couldn't read about how it informed the book. So for me, it would be very interesting if you make that explicit and if you explain how your experience with applied urban research led you to pursue these theoretical projects and led you to these theoretical ideas. And then finally, another very short question. At some point, you say that you agree with Levin that there's nothing so practical as good theory. And so then I wonder, how is the theory that you develop practical? Like, how would you say that it can inform, for instance, urban policies or urban policies? Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Justus. A lot of beef, I would say, as a vegetarian. And I would hand over to Jaime for his comments and then to Elisabetta for his answers.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for organizing this great presentation. And also thank you, Elisabetta, for writing this book. Congratulations. I agree with Justus that it's a very rigorous piece of work. Every concept that is introduced deserves an ensuing discussion on why that concept is being used. And generally, it's a very impressive revision of work that has been done on the city and on specifically on the relations between the city and the state. And as it's already been said, and the book makes this very clear, it's very theoretical, while it argues that it's informed by empirical research and that it builds on existing empirical research. Like Justus, I'm also left wanting to know more about your particular experience with municipalist initiatives, Elisabetta, but I think that could be the next chapter of our conversation. And I just wanted, before getting into questions, I just wanted to refer to some of the interesting things, the main takeaways for me of this book. I think that it does something that it's very interesting in challenging assumptions in a very suggestive and persuasive way. So, for instance, there is a very strong narrative about globalization homogenizing cities, and you make the clear point that each city responds differently to globalization, and then actually you say that urban research should study these differences among cities. Why are cities different? Why do they respond differently to those dominant globalizing forces and also to national and international influences? Other things that the book challenges very clearly. I think it's maybe we take it for granted, but you know, when you say that cities are not places or sites, but they are political agents, and you do this not just by focusing on the last decades, which is very often done, on how there's been, you know, with multi-level governance, how, you know, with devolution, cities have, in theory, gained more initiative or more autonomy. You look at the longue durée, and it's actually fascinating how you go back to the medieval period, the early modern state, etc., etc. Also, another narrative that you challenge very well, there's often emphasis in urban research about intercompetition among cities. And here you make it very, very clearly that there's also a lot of cooperation and different forms of cooperation among cities. Clearly, you problematize and you explain the limits of these forms of cooperation, but I think it's very useful. Also, that very provocative notion of European municipalism as an ideology. You yourself argue that it's, you know, maybe it's not a grand, you call it thin. You said it also today, you call it thin ideology. I think that probably we could, and you yourself probably could argue that maybe, you know, I guess that it's a provocation and that we should, if it's not yet an ideology, maybe we should try and build it and like to make it stronger. And just to finish, another takeaway from the book, this idea about when you talk about citizen activation, this idea that the political is not just when big movements organize and take place. This is very common among urban scholars. It's natural for many of us to be interested in moments of radical conflict and transformation, and generally also, you know, social movements fighting for social justice. But I think that the book invites us to broaden our notion of what is political, and that actually deserves a lot of empirical work, ethnographic work, and to see how maybe smaller forms of political change that are not generally seen as political may have more impact than those social movements that we tend to pay attention to. Then, having said that, just questions, and these are just for you to consider, but not to answer now, just in case you find this interesting for your future research also. Like Justus, my first question or my first comment is that I'm also left with some skepticism as to the capacity of cities to exert substantial change beyond the state and beyond EU directives. I see many limits, especially when we look at the recent experience of different European cities. Also to the experience of the recent municipalist initiatives in Spain and elsewhere. What we've seen very often is that these new governments, local governments that have lasted for 4 or 8 years, have constantly encountered very strong limits. And in fact, they've been very often the victim of very aggressive lawfare, the use of state structures, legal structures, juridical structures to stop any change from happening. So for instance, Barcelona tried to municipalize the management of water. That was stopped in the court. Barcelona tried to regulate rents in the housing market, and this was stopped by different state structures, not just the government, but also different courts, etc. And I could continue. Berlin has had recently a referendum to socialize the housing in the hands of big landlords. And there's a lot of, I mean, this has been blocked at the state level, right? Federal level. While I appreciate the argument in your book, and in fact, the book is optimistic at points, and it's also pessimistic at some. There are parts where it explains how the power of cities can be contained and curtailed by states. My question is very practical, and it's how how is this to be achieved? What kinds of strategies are more successful in advancing municipalist initiatives? How do cities gain more power vis-a-vis the state in recent times? Second question, very shortly, it would be, is really there more cooperation than competition right now among cities? Again, if we look at the literature, theory on uneven development between center, periphery, etc., and other strands of literature, we know that since the 80s, we've seen increased competition among cities, economic competition to attract flows of capital, of people, and not just at the European level, but also in the same country, between capital cities and secondary cities. And so, like Justus mentioned before, the economic aspect seems fundamental. And those forms of economic competition among cities translate also into antagonistic political agendas. So very often we see more tension among cities than cooperation. But maybe what you highlight in the book is that there are many forms of cooperation that are invisible to us, and we should emphasize them. Anyway, but that's how I read it. Maybe you have another explanation. Then I'm finishing. A third question is, you say that cities may become and can become sites of innovation and tailor-made policies to address place-based problems. But very often, we also see a lot of dysfunctionality at the urban level between different bodies and different institutions. You can have a municipality in the same region having a completely different agenda than the municipality next door. And also we see a lot of dysfunctionality when it comes to managing, water services, energy, housing. There's more and more research about the dysfunctional metabolism of cities. And this has to do a lot with the fact that municipalities don't work together, or don't have the means, or are not good enough at working together also. And finally, that was a kind of more open question is, okay, so the book focuses a lot on the agency of cities, on the autonomy of cities. My question would be, so cities are also spaces of class tension, of inequality, of conflict. And then the question would be, how do different forms of class tension within cities impact on the agency of cities in the international realm? So for instance, in the same country, you can have a reactionary city, reacting against the policies approved by the nation state, by the central government. And you can have also a leftist coalition in another city also reacting against that government. And this is also the result of different class coalitions, and it's the result of different class tensions anyway. Also, and just to finish, in fact, I think that the book, even though it doesn't say it explicitly, it tends to be influenced by the experience it tends to be influenced by the experience of leftist municipalist governments, even though it doesn't maybe explicitly say it. When you refer to cities as examples of municipalism or of autonomy, I have the feeling that the empirical stances that have influenced your thought tend to be kind of progressive ones. And I'm done here. Thank you very much, Elisabetta. I'm personally going to recommend this book to many people.
Thanks a lot, Jaime. Well, you have now a lot of issues to be addressed, Elisabetta. I'm not sure you will be able to cover everything but please, the floor is yours to a first reaction, and then we open up the floor if there are comments and questions among the participants.
Yeah, I took note of what has been said by the discussant, and I will try to keep my responses as concise as possible. So I will start with Justus' observations, and if I got it right, so basically, I would say that well, it is true that cities are constrained by the market. So I refer to his intervention about the fact that cities are the theater of capitalistic reconstruction. I would say that I try to avoid explicitly in the book economic discussions, not because I don't think they are relevant, but I think that an economic analysis of capitalism would have made the book different. So I wanted to be more concerned about the politics of municipal autonomy and municipalism at the same time. I think that capitalism, it is a major force driving the way cities behave and the way cities are shaped also from a physical perspective. And well, I see that economic forces are constraining in many cases cities, but at the same time, city governments are harnessing capitalism as a way to become stronger. So possibly there is a little bit of, let's say, maybe we share this progressive leaning. By we intend, as Jaime said, maybe my book has a lingering progressive posture, and I think that also Justus' observation has a little bit of a left-leaning posture, in the sense that in many city administration play along capitalism, and they use it as a way they think it is appropriate for them. I remember carrying out interviews while doing my PhD dissertation, which was exactly about the reason behind the decisions of cities, European cities, in engaging in city networks for sustainability. And a counselor, a progressive counselor, said that a way for them to become more autonomous from the center state was to attract investors. So they wanted to offer the space, physical space, buildings and other amenities in order to attract capital. And in their view, this process of attracting investors and capital was a way for them to become stronger and more autonomous from the central state, because in that way they didn't have to knock the state door and ask for money. So I think that it is a complex dynamic in there. So on the one hand, yes, capitalism is restructuring cities politically and territorially, but at the same time, not all, but many city administrations are using capitalistic opportunities in order to become more autonomous. So that is the side of the argument. In the book, I didn't want to go deep into that side because I think that, as I said, that would have been another book which I didn't want to write, at least not now. Maybe in the future, who knows? But it is a thorny issue. So if you and I analyze city autonomy from a more economic perspective, I think that it is a complex and very nuanced issue. So we might see it, if we have a progressive leaning, we might see capitalism as a force oppressing cities, but because especially if we have a perspective, a more, let's say, socially driven or bottom-up perspective. But if we look at the decision-making process that is undertaken by cities administration, we see that capitalism is actually seen as a tool for them to become more autonomous because they can attract money and investment. Another observation that Justus made was the fact that was a little more pessimistic about our cities actually these important democratizing entities. I actually was quite careful to use the term democracy, democratic, and I think that most of the chapters, if not all, I was quite apologetic about the fact that my idea would have been understood as very enthusiastic about how cities are sites of democracy. Because one thing is to conceptualize cities as political. Of course, I do think that in many cases there are very interesting democratic innovation in cities. But at the same time, there are places where many exclusionary processes are taking place. And so even if democracy is not at the core of the political dynamic of some or many cities, still cities retain their political entities, their political saliency. So I do separate politics and democracy in that sense, because in many cases we see that many cities are not sites of the democratic debate. And on the other hand, I think that was one question, and also another observation by Justus was about the fact that if we can think nowadays cities as freer as they can. Well, I concluded with some brief reflection about what's going to be next in cities' future, and of course, I do know and I acknowledged this in the book that cities are constrained, of course, by national laws. So if the state decides to block their actions, there's no way for city to rebel against a law. And also, Jaime made this kind of observation. So to what extent cities are really free? But it is actually the observation you made actually reinforces the argument about how cities are getting more and more salient from a political perspective, because states are trying to block municipal action, and this is because it means that it is important. While in periods where cities were not that important, states could simply overlook what city did. But if these rebel, or what I call them, the non-compliant cities, are doing something that is really against the state dispositions, then they become a nuisance, and the state had to deal with it. So I think that even this conflict and this attempt of the central state to avert cities' freedom is a sign in itself of how cities are getting more and more important. Last questions from Justus was about why we cannot define municipalism as a left-wing ideology. I made here a distinction. So I used the term European municipalism because I wanted to go back in history and take into account how since the early 20th century, basically, cities got together in order to cooperate. What you Justus might had in mind was the new wave of municipalism, which is actually defined as neo-municipalism, which is actually can be considered as a more progressive type of municipalism. But what I wanted to do in that specific chapter of my book was to conflate the whole municipalist movement. And I said that also because when interviewing local councillors about their participation in municipal networks, they explicitly underscored how cities of many political leaning are part of these cooperative organizations. So of course you have cities administered by center-left, center-right, Greens, or liberal parties. So it is really difficult for that. Of course, there are some attempts of more recently the new municipalist movement is a progressive movement. And also I think that another observation was about where's the evidence in the book. Well, the evidence was the basis for me to reflect upon more theoretical discussions. So without empirical research, it is really difficult to understand phenomena, processes, dynamics in place in the society. Indeed, while answering to your questions and doubts, I quoted many examples of practical research. So by undertaking fieldwork, you actually reflect on theoretical issues. So I hope that I answered your questions, Justus. If not, you let me know. And then I think that I will move to Jaime's observation now. And yeah, you underscore how I emphasize the fact that urban politics is not just about the big movement, but the smaller movements. And actually, this thesis is reinforced by recent data that I gathered through the project I'm working on for the Marie Yoda Fellow at the University of Vienna. And I recently completed a round of interviews with local activists based in Turin, in Italy. And these activists are engaged in very small movement, very local movement. They deal with and they're actually going against the local government, trying to stop building a supermarket. They want to stop the municipality from branching green spaces and knocking down trees. So these are very, very small and localized movements. But actually, I think that they are very important. They're very political, because political in a proper sense, not just about ideology or left and right, because they have a vision of how the city they live in should be. And they're actually providing an important contribution in shape the space, the urban space, by opposing to building a mega project, by opposing to knocking down trees and preserving the green, the urban green. So I feel that these are the important elements that make cities important side of politics, and at the same time, these are also the features that shows how cities are specific and they're different from one another. And this new project reinforces the fact that the Civitas Activa is really shaping the distinctive political and social process ongoing in cities. And another question that I think that Jaime brought up was about the rivalry between cities. So why don't all the cities cooperate together, and they're actually engaged in conflict? Well, I actually wrote an article about that a while ago, which is not part of the book. So, but actually, in that article, I analyzed how cities cooperate and engage in conflict at the same time. So they compete and cooperate. And when they cooperate within networks or any kind of multilateral agreements, it is like competition is suspended. So cooperation, international cooperation, is a sort of entente amicale. They want to work together. Outside their membership, their network membership, they still are in competition, and in many cases, competition for capital. So, as paradoxically as it may sound, that's the way it is. So you cannot erase rivalry among cities. It is really impossible, at least in this system. But it is difficult to say whether it is stronger for them the impetus to compete or to cooperate. I would say that they simply coexist, and there's no other way around it. And I do agree that also with Jaime's observation about the dysfunctionality at the urban level. So in many cases, municipalities don't work together, but that doesn't mean that municipal cooperation is like bogus or something that doesn't exist or whatever. It does exist, but of course the way cities cooperate is selective, and in many cases they cooperate with similar cities, so they need to find a common ground for them to work together. And of course not just their political leaning. So center-left city won't cooperate with a center-right city, but there's also their story, their evolution, their economic profile. I remember again working in the field. I remember that there were cities saying that they would like to work with cities, even if they are based in another country, but they had similar stories. For instance, a city that underwent the process of deindustrialization would look at another city, the city that underwent the similar process. So they would prefer to cooperate with that kind of city because they have something in common. It's about being similar, is the similarities, the likeness among the story and their lived experience that make them cooperate together. So having a complete cooperation of all cities, I think it would be quite impossible. And I would stop my intervention, my response, by reflecting on whether my book is a little bit of left-wing leaning. And it didn't occur to me, but it might be the case that there is a slightly progressive angle to it. But again, here, research experience will rescue me. And I would say that this peculiar angle to my book is due to the fact that reflecting upon my research, I ended up by verifying empirically that progressive cities tend to be more proactive at international level. And years ago, I published an article about this fact, and I used the term serial joiner to define those cities. So progressive cities tend to be serial joiners. They are part of many networks. So they have this impetus to be part of different organizations and networks. So they want to be seen. So possibly there might be this left-wing or progressive angle to the book, which is not really explicit, but is there also because from an empirical perspective, there is also this bias, and then I will stop here. And I would like to thank the discussants for their very interesting and insightful comments.
So thanks a lot, Elisabetta, for your thorough answers and the rich discussion. We are slightly over time, so I'm not sure we are able to collect other questions or comments, but if you have an urgent need to express or ask something, please do it now or stop. Okay, it seems that it's probably, I will stop the recording